Right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James. So just before we start, I'll run you through how we do this, and I will introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Dr. Taylor Atkins, and he is joining us from Northern Illinois University, where he's distinguished teaching professor of history. We'll probably go on to the next slide here because there's a little bit of introduction about Taylor here. So he's written a number of books. Seems to be something about jazz going on here, but obviously today he's going to be talking about a history of popular culture in Japan, a big topic. But it struck me recently, this is one we could probably do with a book on, because most academics seem to focus on something fairly narrow that's their speciality. And it seems to me there's a bit of a shortage of general books about Japanese culture. So this one is very welcome. So over to you, Dr. Taylor Atkins, to introduce your book.
Thank you all very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here, and to all of you all for attending. I'll begin by, let me share my screen here. Okay, so yes, thank you. This book comes from a class that I've been teaching at NIU since 1999. And one of the things that, at least at the time, was unique about it is that is its historical perspective. There are lots of classes on popular culture in Japan around the world, and most of them, which I'm sure students really appreciate, are on the more contemporary forms of popular culture. But being a historian, mine goes further back in time to the 17th century, and I'll explain why here in a little bit. And an editor at Bloomsbury Academic somehow or other found me and asked me if I wanted to write this book. And so I went ahead and submitted a proposal. And the first edition came out in 2017. But I'm going to ask that any of you who own that first edition demote it to a paperweight or a doorstop, because the second edition is so much better. So let's just pretend the first edition didn't happen. So this is an overview of the chapters, and I'm just going to go through these and give you a sense of what's in the book and what it's arguing. It is a book that was written for course adoption, but I wanted it to have an argument. I wanted it to have a theoretical framework. So it's not just a list or a description of all the different forms of Japanese popular culture, or as I prefer to call it, popular culture in Japan, which in my mind are two different things, and we can talk about that later if you wish. But so I do have a particular point of view that I'm trying to get across in this book. First of all, I spent time yesterday with my students trying to define what popular culture is, and it is not as easy to define as a lot of us maybe think it is. So I had to come up with something that is provides some structure for the book and makes the object of study relatively well known. Or so the first is that popular culture consists of cultural spectacles, amusements, habits, and products intended to reach either as big an audience as possible or specialized niche markets. And an important component of this is that it uses technologies of mass reproduction and dissemination. And that popular culture only has meaning in relation to another category of culture or other categories of culture. And that generally, and I'm not endorsing this, I'm just reporting it as historically the way that it's been defined, that popular culture is generally considered to be inferior or aesthetically deficient compared to what I call capital A art. So art is different from entertainment. Popular culture is kitschy, whereas art is tasteful, that sort of thing. And this aesthetic hierarchy mirrors social stratification. So art is for governing and economic elites, and pop for the masses, the working classes. And then finally, the idea that popular culture is and this is the way cultural studies scholars have defined it in the last several decades, many, of course, the leaders, of course, being in the UK, that popular culture can be a mechanism for social control and ideological indoctrination, but it isn't always consumed with that meaning intact, and that consumers and fans and audiences can manipulate and change the meanings of it, sometimes to advantage themselves, and that popular culture, therefore, is an arena where we compete for power, autonomy, meaning. In many ways, we have our most stimulating discussions about the most difficult things in our lives through popular culture. In the US, for instance, people debate things like creationism on bumper stickers or gun control on bumper stickers. So things of that nature. And that second part of the equation comes from the framework that I use, which comes from Antonio Gramsci, and this will be a review for many of you. There are two different views in what's called the structure versus agency debate. First of all, that the culture industry perpetuates capitalist exploitation and oppression of common people. It distracts them from making revolution with trivial matters and appeals to the lowest common denominator, appeals to the stomach and the genitalia, and therefore it renders the masses sort of supine. So this is a top-down approach. And then there's another view that says that popular culture is produced by the non-elites and reflects their own values and interests, and acts as a sort of countercultural sensibility that resists the oppression of the elites. I'm sorry, I went backwards there. So, in other words, there's debate about who, as I say, if popular culture was a car, who's driving? And so the theory of hegemony that Antonio Gramsci put forward is sort of a happy medium between that, if you will, that elites maintain control not through force, but through the creation of an ideological consensus that everybody agrees on and that they regard as common sense. So in the Marxist thought of people like Gramsci, capitalism is portrayed as the only natural and commonsensical economic system, a way of organizing society and economy, and that people who are not particularly advantaged by corporate capitalism will still support and endorse it because theoretically anybody could be Jeff Bezos if they wanted to get off the couch and just be Jeff Bezos. So that the idea that there's potential for economic success and social mobility is what motivates the masses to support it. So like in my country, you'll have people who live in trailer parks voting to lower taxes for the elites because they've absorbed this idea that corporate capitalism is the only way to organize a society. So I've been asked, why do I begin in the 17th century? And it's because of many of the defining characteristics of popular culture that I mentioned before came into existence in the 1600s in Japan. I'm sure many of you know that the 1500s was a time of near constant civil war. The country was reunified by the end of the 16th century. And with that peace, with the growth of castle towns, you had cities emerge, and the people who inhabited those cities were increasingly literate, had more time to spend on leisure pursuits. There were also new technologies of mass production of materials, of print materials in particular, through woodblock printing, and what we would call a culture industry had or an infrastructure for producing cultural products emerged as well in the 1600s. And in the Edo period, that consisted of things like book lending libraries, where for a small fee you could borrow a book for a period of time, publishing houses, theaters for kabuki and puppet theater, and that sort of thing. So, and then of course there was sort of an obsession with novelty, with celebrities, and an unprecedented access to information, not only about Japan, but also the outside world. And then finally, we've been in the habit of blaming all kinds of social ills. In my country, things like mass shootings on popular culture, on violent video games, or things of that nature. But popular culture around the world has been blamed for a variety of problems, that it instigates moral panics, and sometimes motivates the creation of censorship regimes. And in Japan, it's almost amusing to me because it's repeated so often from the 1600s into the 1900s, this idea of disturbing or disrupting fuzoku. And in the book, I try to sometimes bring a humorous voice. And so at some time in the book, I say fuzoku are perennially endangered like a damsel in distress, because every time some new cultural phenomenon comes around, that's the blame, is that it's affecting society in a negative way, taking away from the way that some Japanese believed everybody should act. A lot of the popular culture of the Edo period, of course, was based in or emerged from the pleasure districts, the licensed pleasure districts. The shogun's government realized that prostitution and theaters and things like that were going to proliferate no matter what. The idea was, rather than stomp them all out, was to control them by putting them in a special place that people had to spend a lot of trouble going to, and hopefully that would motivate them not to go, although that didn't work. They would, decide on, pick a piece. I don't know why this is doing this. Pick a piece of swampy land outside of the city gates, and, as many as 15, 20 miles or something like that. And then if anybody wanted to partake of the erotic entertainment or the theater, tea houses, things like that, they would have to go there for it. And this was basically, the idea was that if you contain it and put it within actual tangible walls, its influence on the rest of normal society would be contained. But of course, that's not what happened. And in part because of print culture, because the ukiyo, which is a Buddhist concept for the floating idea of the floating world, the ephemeral world, was depicted in pictures like this, so that people who never even set foot in the ukiyo or the pleasure districts had an idea of what was going on there. And the prostitutes, the geisha, the theater actors, the musicians set the tone for or set the fashions, and that so people who who never even went there would be able to at least know what was going on there. And all the major cities had these pleasure districts outside their walls. So yes, the creation of print culture led to the. I'm supposed to be giving you all trigger warnings. I don't know why this is doing this, but just excuse me 1 minute. I'm sorry. That these in literature, in pictures, what was going on in the pleasure quarters was made known. And I just want to, there's a sexually explicit image coming up that I just want to warn you all about. I just want to give you a flavor of the imagination that went into eroticism. Back then, they would have people doing, acrobatic sex acts. And now, of course, the government didn't like this kind of stuff and would periodically crack down on it. But it still went on, and that was one of the things about the people in the entertainers, the culture industry in the Edo period, is that they were endlessly sort of ingenious in figuring out ways to either subvert or distract the censorship regime, or flatter the people who were in charge, so that they would get off their backs. The most popular form of entertainment in the Edo period, of course, was theater. And in this slide here, you see a picture of Izumo no Okuni, who was was regarded pretty much as the inventor of kabuki. Now, because later on women were not allowed on the stage, kabuki obviously changed a great deal. But one of the objections that the government raised about kabuki was cross-dressing, and the fact that and then songs that were sexually suggestive and things like that. During the Edo period, gender fluidity was very much part of the entertainment world. And obviously, in a society that was as status conscious as the Tokugawa regime was, everybody had their proper role to play in society. Obviously, they preferred more strict and stable boundaries of gender roles. So the most popular forms, initially at least in the 18th century, was bunraku or joruri, which is the puppet theater. And then from the late 18th century, kabuki became more popular. And I don't know how many of y'all have seen kabuki plays, but if you have, you know that the makeup, the costumes, the props, the stage environment, and sometimes acrobatics and special effects were always changing and becoming more sort of extreme to be more novel and to keep audiences interested. And the most popular or the most well-known playwright of the day now is Chikamatsu Monzaemon, who argued that art is something which lies in the slender margin between the real and the unreal. And this really is a good description of the theater of the time. One of the reasons that it was so popular was because townspeople would see themselves on the stage. Stories that were set in their own communities or in places that they would recognize, and with characters like themselves would be there. But but I would not say, today we reward good acting as somebody who imitates reality well and is able to get us to suspend disbelief. Well, there was no effort to really mimic reality in that same way in Edo period theater. It was very stylized, very, what we might call histrionic or over the top, but that was its aesthetic. That was what people went for. They wanted to see kabuki actors not mimic reality, but to represent a particular type of character, especially in what was called aragoto, really macho warriors. And so they weren't necessarily looking for realism. Nonetheless, they did see themselves and scenarios and people that they could recognize on the stage. And one of the interesting things also is, and Chikamatsu was very involved in this, is a lot of times they would show common people exhibiting the same virtues that were expected of the samurai. And it was sort of a way of asserting the possibility that common people could achieve the same level of virtue that supposedly the warrior caste alone were able to exhibit because of their innate superiority. But I want to point out that this is an example of hegemony as expressed by Gramsci, that rather than rejecting the values system of the warriors, common people accepted it. They just claimed that they too, or were asserting, slyly on the stage, that they too were capable of such virtues. In chapter 3, I talk about the impact of the world on early modern Japan. As many of you are aware, a lot of times the Edo period is called an era of isolationism. But my own mentor, Ron Toby, and a few other scholars have demonstrated that Japan was connected to at least some countries during that period. The only European country was the Netherlands. But then they were also had relations, diplomatic relations with the Ryukyu Kingdom, with Korea. They had trade relations with the Ainu, and unofficially with Chinese. So this is a new chapter in the book. It's what was originally a section of the old chapter 2 that I have expanded into its own chapter. And it talks about the different ways that people had access to knowledge about the world. Among the things that permeated popular culture were images of the various embassies that would visit Edo. These were usually from Korea, from Ryukyu, or from the Dutch East Indies Company that was in Deshima, off the coast of Nagasaki. These so-called Nagasaki-e show the Dutch and also Chinese, because there were Chinese traders there. So this was a genre of pictorial art called Nagasaki-e. And because Nagasaki was the only place where the Dutch and the Chinese could live and trade, people who never went to Nagasaki would, through print culture, have access to what you might call at least ethnographic snapshots. There was also a genre called Ainu-e, and this is the famous part of a famous series of portraits of Ainu chieftains. And you know, you can see that the artists here found ways to distinguish their subjects from Japanese people, and this became a way of articulating difference. In the case of Ainu, they oftentimes dramatize their hair and the hair on their facial hair. And then this is an example of a festival that's still going, that originated back in the Edo period, when embassies from the Korean kingdom would come over the course of the Edo period. Common people would have these festivals or these dances, and some of that imitated the Koreans. And you can see that in some communities, they still do that. I want to thank my former doctoral student, Hyung Choi, who helped me a lot with doing research on the Korean aspect here. One chapter is about censorship and the battle about propriety and the ways that commoners were sort of self-assertive within the context of the warrior regime. So I apologize for this. I didn't know that these were set on a timer. A lot of times the regime would put out what they called kenyaku-rei, which were sumptuary edicts that were designed to try to suppress the more excessive sexual content, the more subversive material from popular culture, and to try to get popular culture to reflect the moral values of Neo-Confucianism. So there was this phrase, kanzen choaku, which meant to reward virtue and punish vice. So in other words, what they expected, what they wanted to see in cultural materials were things that that didn't encourage evil, if you will. And yet, some of the most popular material of the time was stuff about bandits, about Yakuza. And a lot of that material about bandits in particular came from China. So there was a way for people to sort of celebrate rebellion, even if they didn't engage in it, if you will. And that should be familiar to us today. We do the same thing in our culture. As we go into the 19th century and into the Meiji period and the Meiji Restoration and reforms, there were some forms of culture that from the Edo period that actually hung on. One of those was the misemono, which are the street carnivals and freak shows that existed at the time. Another example are the so-called variety halls, or yoseis. Sometimes these are called like vaudeville halls, that had a variety of different kinds of entertainments that would include narration of texts from puppet plays, even though without the puppets, or rakugo, which is comic storytelling, or acrobatics, or music, or things like that. And these, you'll say, were, it persisted into the 20th century and provided a way of conserving, not necessarily in the same form, but preserving some of the traditional forms of entertainment from the Edo period. So, for instance, at a time when puppet theater was no longer being performed at this time, at least there were people who were still performing the texts from them. And those for a lot of audiences, those were enough. Okay. Moving on then. So there was some continuity of cultural activities from the Edo period, but then there were also new forms of popular culture that developed. And some of these were more explicitly rebellious. They, in some cases, they were connected to what's generally called the Freedom and People's Rights movement, which was usually tried to promote elected assemblies, human rights for all, and that sort of thing. And so in the chapter on the Meiji Restoration, I talk about the efforts to reform the kabuki theater. And not all of, even though the government did have an interest in this and did try to guide it, a lot of the reform was actually done by the kabuki actors and theater proprietors themselves, in part because they wanted to contribute to this modernization project, and they wanted to erase the stigma, social stigma attached to their profession. But this was also the time of the beginning of political cartoons or visual satire, such as in this magazine here, which is called Maru Maru Chinbun, that would, ridicule politicians and the oligarchs who led the Meiji period, but also foreigners, and also make fun of Japanese who were imitating uncritically Western manners. There was also street singing, where college students who weren't going to classes but had particular political points of view would stand out on the street corner, sometimes with a violin accompaniment or shamisen, and they would pass out or sell song sheets with newly composed songs that reflected their political views. And then finally, a type of theater called shinpa, which was based in kabuki and was at least initially, the main actors were kabuki actors. So they retained some of the theatrical conventions of kabuki, but with modern content and sometimes with political content. Okay, then into the 20th century, I write about the culture of modernism, Japanese modernism, as expressed in these two icons, the mobo and the moga, and the era of what's called erotic grotesque nonsense. One of the arguments that I make in the book, is that if you went to Japan in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, you would recognize a lot of the forms of entertainment because they were, at least originally, came from other parts of the world, usually North America and Europe. But they also looked different, and scholars call this vernacular modernism, where it's part of a global movement, but it's articulated or in very specific ways in specific places and for specific reasons. And so, even though these people look like flappers and dandies, like this guy's got these Harold Lloyd glasses and hat, and they evoke some of the same moral panic. They also were challenging very specifically Japanese norms and fulfilling particular Japanese needs. So this chapter goes on to talk more about what I call cosmopolitan modernism, the idea, our native articulations of global culture. So I talk about silent film narrators. This was something that didn't really catch on outside of East Asia that I'm aware of, at least, or it didn't stick. But if you went to see a silent film in the 1900s all the way into the 30s, Japanese would have a narrator standing to the side who would narrate all the parts, make commentary, explain the action, especially if they were watching foreign films. And these characters, called benshi, became actually celebrities on their own. And sometimes people would want to see the same movie narrated by more than one benshi so they could see their different styles. This was also a time where popular music was very much influenced by jazz and tango and rumba and other and chanson from France. And so popular music was very diverse and had very diverse origins, but again, oftentimes was translated into Japanese, so it would speak to Japanese. I also talk about social dance through commercial dance halls, detective fiction, and spectator sport, and the increasing participation of Japan in global sports competition. I recently wrote an article about Japanese football and the intra-imperial contest between Korea and Japan during the colonial period, and where Koreans won 73% of their matches. I did I found all the match results that I possibly could involving Koreans and Japanese between 1926 and 1942, and I don't remember what the goal differential was, but it was whopping huge, like 200 plus goal differential. So that sort of segues into the next chapter, which is basically in two parts, and it's called Entertaining Empire. And the first part talks about the way that this modern cosmopolitan culture from Japan was then exported to the colonies, but then the ways that it was articulated there and the way it suited local needs. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the next slide. This is my view is partially blocked. Let me move on. This is what I'm talking about. That in the colonies, in many ways, this what's called colonial modernity was intended as a way to bind the colonies to the metropole through shared consumption of mass culture. But in other ways, it suited the needs of the colonized peoples themselves. And it was a way for them to occasionally stick their thumb in the eye of their colonizer. One example here is the famous Kano baseball team from Taiwan. That was a multi-ethnic team that made it to the finals of the 1931 Koshien tournament. And the Taiwanese, there was said that the only way they could beat Japan was in competitive sport. So going back to this is what I call colonial, Na Young Amy Kwan calls colonial kitsch. And it's content about the empire, about the colonies that became part of the popular culture. And so it includes people like Otaka Yoshiko, who was Japanese, but born in China and grew up speaking Mandarin fluently. And for her movie career in the 30s and 40s, people thought she was actually Chinese. And the movie studio in Manchuria actually wanted to maintain that fiction. And she would appear in movies as Chinese and recalcitrant Chinese who would inevitably fall in love with a Japanese person and become more, agreeable and accepting of the Japanese presence there. You can also see there were postcards that people would send of Taiwanese, Aboriginal Taiwanese, including headhunting. So I don't know how you'd feel if you got a postcard like this in your mailbox, but conceivably back in the 20s and 30s, that would happen. Okay. There's a chapter in which I take all three of Japan's modern wars, the Sino-Japanese, Russo-Japanese, and World War II, and talk about the impact that it had. I argue that war and popular culture had a symbiotic relationship in that war provided content for the burgeoning mass media, and then the mass media helped promote the war and the cause for the war and tried to motivate the population to sacrifice for the war efforts. And this took the form of obviously visual satire, but also it had an impact on music, making military songs popular. And then also In the Sino-Japanese War, especially, there were senso engeki, or plays that had war themes that were designed to promote, tell people what was going on, or disseminating information or altered misinformation, alternative facts, if you will, to the populace about what was going on, and tried to build support. Part of the next chapter deals with the U.S. occupation of Japan, and a time when American music, baseball, dancing, movies were all sort of very intentionally brought to Japan as part of the effort to democratize and demilitarize the culture. During that time, the Americans, for instance, banned samurai films because they believed that samurai films created this militaristic culture that they had just defeated and wanted to get rid of in Japan. I argue that after the occupation and after the war, post-war culture was very diffused with or suffused, I guess, with nostalgia and also a sense of precarity. You see this, of course, in the original Godzilla movie, and the way that it expresses fears of nuclear warfare. But that carries over into other genres and into later monster movies as ever. And it's not just nuclear war. It's earthquakes too. There are lots of disaster movies. And the impression that one gets at a time when Japan is being very successful economically is that they had a very precarious sense, that things were going to fall apart, and that they were constantly in danger, and including some of their native traditions that they thought were being swept away in the post-war period. I talk also about the beginnings of Manga Mania. We know that Japan, printed manga cartoons have been very popular in Japan for many years, more so than in other cultures. And these are two of the most important, prominent ones of the post-war period, Sazae-san, which originated as a sort of feminist cartoon, but then eventually became much more conservative and focused on, nuclear family values. And then, of course, Tezuka Osamu, the creator of all of these different characters, and the way he expressed sort of the sensibilities and the fears and the longings, the yearnings of post-war Japanese. Of course, today we know that Japanese entertainment industry has had a huge impact on global entertainment. The United States used to be the main source of that, of global entertainment, but now Japan is very much in there, and now Korea is as well. And, anime is obviously very popular, but also the aesthetic of kawaii-sa, of cuteness, and then video games, as we know, are very much, especially sort of the video games that have kind of a narrative structure. That's very much part of Japan, Japanese brand. For better or worse, a lot of people think of Japan as being of Japanese popular culture as being uniquely sort of perverted. And this is just an Onion story. The Onion is a satirical newspaper in the United States, and this sort of alludes to that and makes fun of it. And I love the Onion. And so even though, I don't necessarily think this is entirely true or fair, the stuff does exist. It's just not as mainstream as some people think it is. But it makes fun of that. But then this is very deadly serious here. A state representative in Ohio in 2020 passed legislation that Susan Napier's scholarly book about anime not be assigned in college classes. And it's because of this sort of reputation that Japanese popular culture was uniquely depraved. And so that's a quote that he made when trying to justify banning that particular book. He was afraid that if the book comes out, that people are going to be, again, disrupting Fuzoku, right? American Fuzoku would be disrupted by the uniquely pornographic Japanese popular culture. there's a Joseph Nye's concept of soft power as a way of sort of winning friends diplomatically and getting them to think of you positively. Popular culture is very much part of Japan's diplomatic strategy today. There is collusion between the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry with the Japanese entertainment industry to try to leverage the popularity of JPC around the world in ways that are advantageous for Japanese diplomacy and foreign relations. And you'll see here, this is a Taiwanese airline that uses Hello Kitty motifs. I once flew on Ava Air, and they have a little screen that shows a cartoon of Hello Kitty. They have kiosks where you can get your boarding passes that are shaped like Hello Kitty, and they have Hello Kitty barf bags. So I end the book by asking this question: what makes JPC Japanese? And you look at all these different things, and my answer is that there's nothing that holds all this together necessarily, except for the fact that it's created by people who live in a political entity called Japan, primarily by and for people who speak its national language. And that if you look at all these different forms, there's nothing that really aesthetically or substantively holds them all together. And one of the reasons I use the phrase popular culture in Japan rather than Japanese popular culture is I want to move away from this idea that all the entertainment that's produced there expresses something that captures the essence of Japan, because I don't believe that's true. There are people, obviously, who do intentionally try to do that, or do draw upon Japanese aesthetic traditions and things like that, but they also draw on folklore and mythology from other countries, from other parts of the world. And they're not confined creatively by sort of their Japanese identity. So I'm basically arguing there's nothing that essential that holds all this together, but it manifests in different forms and it articulates lots of different sensibilities and ideas. So I'm sorry that I had the problem with my slides changing automatically, but I'm done now with my talk, and I'm ready to take questions.
Great.
Thank you for your attention.